All praises to the horizon, peace, wealth, and wisdom. It's the wise one here, Mr. Solace Usir. And today I want to take a short moment out to explain to you guys the difference between indigenous or aboriginal and native. You have the word Native Americans and, native to a land. We assume this is the same as indigenous or aboriginal, but I want to explain to you how they're different. The reason for that, many things I explain to you guys when dealing with colonization is not fully grasped because you guys do not fully grasp what indigenous men are in comparison to us and native, which would be like our ancestors. And so I want to explain this as short as possible. Now, on every continent, of course, first you have your indigenous men or your aboriginal men. They usually have very little clothing on, usually just like something covering their genitals, and that's it. Paint and things like this on themselves to kind of block themselves from the sun so they don't burn, and to keep the bugs off. Of course, they have their wisdom as well. And so, as I said, most indigenous men, or all of them, they usually have little to no clothing on. They may only have a string just tying the penis, to the stomach so it won't flap all around. This is your indigenous men. Simple thing to grasp. The word aboriginal, no different. And so this is your indigenous men. Now, after these indigenous men come into contact with what we call the colonizers, so you get offspring or descendancy falling in the balance, meaning they're mixed with both colonizer blood as well as indigenous. Now, of course, this first generation of descendants, they still associate themselves with the indigenous men, so to say, meaning they view themselves as they view the indigenous men as their ancestors. But they live in a world now full of colonizers, and they have nationalities in their way of life, and they are making the world or that continent that way. And so now you have your first descendant generation, your second descendant generations, as they're mixing and merging, so you're getting more generations, more descendants over time. These are your natives. So you can use America as an example. When we speak of Native Americans and their tribes, those were not indigenous men, but they are a couple of generations after, where they still have some of the indigenous people ways and wisdom, and they have the colonizers as well. And so the colonizers have nationalities because they have cities and nations. They came that way. And so these natives, which are the descendants of the indigenous men, but of course they have colonizers' ways as well as their blood. They live in a new place now. New meaning things are changing, the ways. And so this is why Native Americans, the tribes, have names. An Iowa, which would be Cherokee, your Chickasaw, your different tribal names. This is just, over generations, it's slowly going to cities, nations, and nationalities in that place. Of course, the people are in that place. You get it? And so the natives of the land, you can use America as an example. The Native Americans are not the indigenous people, but they are a later time. You get it? Some people may call them Indians, but that's a later time. As time goes on, of course, you get more descendants from these mixing and mingling of different people. And so, of course, these tribes and villages grow into cities and nations. And so tribal names change into nationalities. Meaning indigenous men have no nationalities. They have no tribal names. They have no names of the continent or areas that they live in. Once they are colonized and they begin to have their first generation of offspring, which are now mixed, they take on tribal names, have villages and things like this because they're mixed. As you continue to get the mixed breeding, meaning from these natives and these colonizers now, because those indigenous are now wiped out. They either died of old age, and of course their descendancy is mixed. And so the mixing still continues. The place is more developed. And so those tribes and villages grow into cities and nationalities. But all the tribal names, cities, and nationalities that we take on, it just adds to the confusion that the colonizers brought to the place. And so I want you guys to grasp, even our ancestors, when we pull for certain tribes like Cherokee, Chickasaw, this is fine. But understand in totality that even they were lost, they were already colonized by that point. And so the same way we have ancestors from 50 years ago where y'all say, man, I know they was lost. 100 years ago, y'all say, man, I don't see how they can just go with the things that was going. And so you have to grasp, even if you go back into antiquity, lost is not something new. Meaning, if we're lost in our ancestry and lost in our history and kind of lost in the world, lost is passed down. And so you'd have to go pretty far back in the lands of American history to get to the truth of the matter. And so you have to go back to the beginnings before colonization happened here. Now, I'm not saying when Christopher Columbus came here, that was the first time they ever had contact. But the developing of the continent happened then. And so this is when colonization officially happened. Any contact prior to that, so it was just a light upraising. Meaning whoever they came into contact with, they learned whatever they learned, and so they went on their way. This be your Leif Eriksons and whoever else. But they went on their way. You know, the people of the land kind of retained whatever information they left to them. 1492 is when the colonization happened, when, you know, the terrain is changed and the ways of the people is completely changed. And so I say that so you guys grasp, when y'all spread around, you know, nationalities and things like that, y'all are spreading the confusion. All is simple. Every continent that you see, whether Africa, India being a country, but the continent that India's on, because they changed these names of these things, Eurasia, they change it over time. But every continent we have, it started with indigenous men on the continent. Then the colonizers came. Then those indigenous men mixed and merged with those colonizers. Of course, most of them were killed off, because once they have contact, they get sick. And so usually, you know, the children in the community, they usually survive the contact. Their immune system being a little more stronger. They're young. It is them, you know, that kind of births the offspring. And so now you have first generation descendants. And that will turn into second generation descendants. This is when you start to get your tribes and tribal names, and the people calling themselves the natives of the land. But they are not the indigenous people who are the true natives of the land, but they're as close as you're going to get at that point. If you go any farther back before them, well, indigenous men don't have nationalities or tribal names. And so it's a matter of that. As you keep going, those tribal names and villages become your cities and nationalities. But as you can clearly see, it causes for the separation. The separation being a part of the science of colonization. Meaning colonization is not just about developing up a continent, but confusing the people, making them go against one another. And so when we view ourselves as different nationalities, this is all completely wrong. Whether you're white or a black nationality, you are truly just a result of colonization. And so we all need to grasp that. Meaning if you go back to the beginnings of this world, when the first continent was being colonized, you had your white albino. This is a separate race from what we call white people today. This is before white people. And so you had your white albinos and your indigenous men on every continent. The white albinos colonized those indigenous men. From that first joining, you get your black albino. You get it? And so that black albino merges with both sides. It doesn't have to just be one, but those black albinos, they merge back with both sides, meaning the indigenous as well as the white albino. Now when that black albino merges back with the white albino, so you get your red, orange hair, whites. Y'all call them like the Vikings. You get your blondes from, those reds or orange heads merging back in with those white albino. And from there, you get your rest. Meaning when those red and orange heads begin to merge in with the indigenous men. So you get your black and brown hair races of whites. Now when that black albino, which is white skin, merges back in with the indigenous people, so you get your many different shades and variations of them as well. Then from there, you got your red, orange hairs, you got your blonde hair whites, mixing and merging with your many different variations of indigenous men. And so over time, you can see how you get many different variations of people. But all those white nationalities, meaning your blondes, your red, orange heads, your brown heads, your black heads, as well as all your many different shades of your colored or black races, we are one race of man. Meaning you got your indigenous men, then you got your white albinos, and then you got, what comes from that, which is your many variations in between white albino and black indigenous. And so I just explained how you get your white variations. I explained how you get your black indigenous variations. And so as you can clearly see, it wouldn't matter if you're black or white. If you're not indigenous or a white albino, well then you just that in-between race that they call demigod in the past. And so kind of get a better understanding of nationalities. Hopefully that was clear and you guys grasped. I'm not sure. But I have a little West African fly in here. I have to get rid of him. Peace, wealth, and wisdom.